Hey everyone, we're going to start now the second of our two videos for this week. In the first video, we had discussed some of the psychological biases that can interfere with inquiry and get in the way of the sort of open-mindedness and fair-mindedness that are needed to carry out an inquiry successfully. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the social and the cognitive biases that can also interfere with inquiry, and then begin discussing a few strategies that we can employ to avoid the negative impacts of these biases, the negative impacts of fallacies upon inquiry and upon discussion. So there are two social biases that we're going to talk about in this context of sort of biases that can negatively impact inquiry. Social biases, think of these as basically features of sort of group dynamics and the ways that groups interact with one another that can get in the way of inquiry and make inquiry harder. So the first of these is the bias that's called groupthink. Probably heard of this before. It also sometimes gets called echo chambers. You sometimes hear that language get employed as well. The way groups tend to work is that people within a group tend to be reasonably uniform in the things that they believe. Now, groups aren't completely uniform, certainly. But my guess is most of the people you spend most of your time with, say your most important friend groups, your most important family groups, probably tend to share at least a lot of beliefs in common. It's probably relatively rare, particularly, again, maybe for, say, important things, for people within a group to disagree about them. Now, not that it doesn't happen again, but this is just a general tendency. Groups tend to be relatively uniform. There's two potentially negative consequences that could result from this uniformity, though, that we sort of need to be on guard with in terms of formulating our own beliefs. So the first of these negative results of groupthink is that people have a tendency to change their beliefs to conform to what it is that other people in their group believe, right? Just sort of in the sense of wanting to go along with what everyone else is saying. That in and of itself isn't necessarily a problem if what causes people to change their beliefs is indeed other people in the group presenting good evidence. But often people change their beliefs for sort of irrelevant reasons or not on the basis of good evidence, good reasons. And so they come to believe things without really having good reasons for their beliefs, simply because it's what other people around them believe. A second danger of groupthink, closely related to the first one, is that since you tend to get rid of competing views and competing voices, it tends to be the case that discussions in groups tend to get more extreme over time. The beliefs and opinions that people articulate tend to be sort of more extreme versions of a belief because there's no one sort of pushing back against it. No one pushing back. So again, let's do the libertarian example. Say I'm in a group of people who tend to think more libertarian. My libertarian beliefs will probably tend to get more extreme over time because no one will be pushing back against the things that I believe. And so my beliefs will sort of tend to trend more toward more extreme versions of a libertarian belief, which doesn't necessarily mean that those more extreme versions are wrong, but more extreme beliefs and more extreme conclusions require higher degrees of evidence and more evidence to actually support. And so the tendency of beliefs to get more and more extreme within a group is problematic because the evidence level usually just doesn't correspond and justify the sort of more extreme version of some belief. We'll talk about this a little bit later also in terms of the cognitive bias of overconfidence. The more extreme your belief is, the more evidence you need to actually justify it, and people usually don't have that evidence actually to justify the more extreme conclusion. The second of these biases is what we're going to call inside-the-box thinking. This is sort of the social version, or the social group dynamic version of identification with belief and ideological fixity. So group identity frequently is defined by certain beliefs, just like our individual identities are defined by believing certain things. And so calling some of these beliefs into question indeed could call into question sort of how the group fits together, threaten the entire group, and people are reluctant, understandably, to do that because usually there's something really good about sort of the group that they belong to. This is why people frequently, it seems like, almost get so worked up by almost what seem from the outside like relatively minor points, maybe like food issues or something, like how do we prepare chili or something, right? Like it might seem unimportant, and yet if it's part of how a group identifies itself, calling that belief into question threatens the belief, threatens the group, and so therefore people are just reluctant to do that, to preserve the group, to sort of just maintain a kind of fixity with belief. Something similar is also true with the fact that groups tend to sort of justify doing things just because it's what the group has done in the past. This is the way we do things. Is sort of presented as kind of evidence to justify why people believe and do what they do within some group, right? This is how we do things where I'm from or whatever. The problem is that just sort of like with ideological fixity in general, people sort of don't see these sort of like, well, that's the way we do things here, as itself being something that needs to be justified. They see it kind of as self-evident, and so therefore, again, tend to shut down or distort or just dismiss outright anything that disagrees with it, not really because of any good reasons. Again, though, that's going to hinder the sort of open-mindedness and fair-mindedness that's needed for inquiry. The last set of biases that we're going to talk about are what are called cognitive biases. These are basically features of how actually our brains just work, how our brains process information usually. That, again, not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but in some circumstances will indeed hinder inquiry, and so we'll need to be aware of these sort of almost as cognitive blind spots that all of us possess and be on guard against them and try to sort of, resist their negative impulses in some contexts. So let's start with what gets called the representative bias. This is our tendency to think that our own experience is typical, normal, and that other people's experiences are more or less similar to our own. I think we'd actually want to say in general that's a really good thing, actually, right? I mean, that's why I assume that, if I touch the burner when I'm 2 and it really hurt, I assume that the same thing will be true for you, that if you touch the burner, it'll hurt. So that's a reasonable belief in a lot of cases. Where this becomes problematic is that if I assume that things that I myself haven't experienced must not be real, or if I tend to dismiss people who have experiences that are very different than my own. Because while in a lot of ways my beliefs are typical, a lot of other respects, I haven't experienced an enormous amount of things that other people have had the ability to experience. I mean, just look at sort of almost like kind of silly things. I've never been to China. 1 billion people, though, if more, have been to China, right? My experience is not typical of those people's experiences, and if I dismiss what those people say because it doesn't conform with my own experience, right, that would be then a danger that would lead me to privilege and not be sort of fair-minded about views that sort of disagree with my own, or views that are based upon people having experiences that I myself have not experienced. Similarly, I also might, on the basis of this, have a tendency to just over-privilege things that I've experienced, give my own experiences too much weight. We saw this earlier in the semester with the anecdotal evidence fallacy. Very similar mistake is what's called the availability or vividness bias, and we're just going to combine the two for the purposes of this class. This is our tendency to sort of over-privilege experiences of ours that are particularly vivid or make a strong impression upon us, right? If I see something and it really makes a big impact on me, I can very easily recall the memory. I'm way more likely to remember it in the course of some inquiry. And again, this makes quite a bit of sense. If I touch the hot stove top when I'm 2 and it's really, really hot and it really, really hurts, I'm not going to do it again. I'm going to be able to recall that memory quickly, and therefore that privilege will, that bad experience will sort of shape my experiences. So good thing in a lot of cases. Again, the danger, though, is that we have a tendency to dismiss or minimize the importance of evidence that just doesn't make as strong of an impact on us. If I see a homeless man die in the street of cold and starvation, that's probably going to be a pretty big experience in my life that makes a pretty strong impact on me. But if I just hear statistics about the same thing, those statistics aren't going to be as important to me, but the statistics probably actually matter way more. The statistics maybe are suggesting this isn't just happening once in the one time that I saw, it's happening all over the place. And so privileging sort of vivid, strong memories of mine over sort of things that don't make as much of an impression on me causes me to sort of dismiss and minimize perfectly good evidence just because for whatever reason it didn't make as strong of an impression. The next of these biases is what's called the overconfidence bias. And I mentioned this one a little bit earlier too, so it's worth talking about sort of in some detail. In general, the way that our brains work is that once we sort of decide that something is true, we just tend to go with it. Yep, that's right. I'm going to now act on that basis. And again, this is useful, right? Particularly because usually we actually act on the basis of our beliefs, and even if our beliefs maybe aren't 100% certain or 100% settled, we need to at least act confidently. We need to at least act as if we've got everything figured out to sort of successfully accomplish things, right? So, okay, this isn't necessarily, again, a problem, but where does it become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem because frequently we're more confident in our beliefs than the evidence actually justifies. And this can have a bunch of negative consequences. It can make us sort of reluctant to challenge beliefs that actually we don't really have that great of evidence for. And it can also cause us, again, to become more extreme in the beliefs that we have formed, far more extreme in our beliefs than actually is supported or warranted by the evidence actually available to us. The last of our biases is what we're going to call the confirmation bias. And this is just our brains, again, because we have a tendency to just settle on something and go with it, our brains have a tendency to favor evidence and information that sort of just basically already confirms what it is that we believe, and be suspicious or avoid evidence that doesn't indeed confirm things that we already believe, or that contradicts things we already believe. Again, this isn't always necessarily bad. It's frequently quite prudent, actually, to be suspicious of certain kinds of new evidence that really conflicts with, what you imagine the world is like or how you imagine that the world is structured. If I came to you and said, hey, guess what? I've discovered brand new evidence that suggests that human beings are made of iron, not carbon. That's a really novel, radical view. It makes sense to be suspicious of it, right? The burden of proof would very much be on me to establish my new claim. But where confirmation bias becomes really dangerous is, given that many of our beliefs really aren't that well formed in the first place, we often just sort of only look at things that confirm beliefs that we have that might not have been well formed to begin with. And then we also, even worse, tend to be really suspicious and just dismissive of new evidence that doesn't confirm what it is that we already believe. It just doesn't make as much of an impact, right? So think about sort of like some sort of superstitious beliefs about bad luck. If I'm like, oh man, every time a black cat walks in front of me, I have bad luck. Remember last week, I saw a black cat, then I failed my test, and a year ago, I saw a black cat, and maybe I fell down the stairs and broke my arm. Black cats are so unlucky. The problem of confirmation bias is that I'm just not going to think about all the times that I saw a black cat and nothing happened, right? Those aren't going to make any kind of impact on me. Again, they're probably not going to be available and vivid in the same sort of way, right? And so my belief has very little evidence to justify it in the first place, and I'm going to ignore evidence that doesn't actually confirm my belief that the black cat is unlucky. So we need to be really suspicious of our own tendencies to dismiss certain kinds of evidence and to accept other kinds of evidence. Alright, so now we've identified these various sort of psychological, social, and cognitive biases that can interfere with inquiry. Now let's talk about some strategies that we can employ to sort of avoid them. This is necessarily going to be a little bit sort of schematic, a little brief, a little rushed in a lot of ways, but at least these are some things to keep in mind, and these are sort of the strongest pieces of advice I can give you if you want to be a more rational thinker in your own life, and if you want to engage in inquiry better. These are some things that it's really worth sort of practicing, cultivating within ourselves. So the first thing, and probably in a lot of ways the sort of most important of these, be aware of what your biases are. Be aware of your biases. Know what things you have good evidence for. Evaluate things, though. Figure out what you don't necessarily have the best of evidence for, too. So, know yourself well. Know where you come to, what your biases are, what your weaknesses are when you come to a conversation. Because if you know these things, you can be on guard against them. Indeed, frequently when I teach, this isn't as relevant in logic classes, but frequently I teach a lot of sort of historical figures in philosophy. That's the big thing that I tend to teach. And I've got my views about a lot of these figures. Frequently I'll begin classes by just telling students, hey guys, we're going to talk about Hegel today. Here's what I think about Hegel. Here's where I'm coming from Hegel. I'm not saying you need to come from the same place as I do, but you should all be aware, and I should be aware of the limitations that I'm going to bring to this discussion, because we're all inevitably going to bring limitations to discussions, right? We all have our biases. We've all got our blind spots. Conversely, we all have our strengths and the things we know really well. If we sort of take stock of those well, know what they all are, we'll be able to approach inquiry in a much better sense, and we'll be able to sort of have other people help us in places where we're weak, right? Have people sort of call us out maybe when, a problematic bias is hindering our ability to evaluate an argument, say. Second suggestion I would really make is slow down. Right, we talked about earlier with this sort of, rushing to respond, psychological bias, right? People have a tendency to want to go really quickly, reach conclusions really quickly, make arguments really quickly, and really the opposite is kind of what you need to do. There's a philosophy joke from a philosopher named Wittgenstein, who joked that sort of the winner of the philosophical race is the one that actually goes the slowest, right? The person who sort of takes their time, is careful, doesn't just say the first thing that pops into their heads, because I'll just speak for myself. The first thing that pops into my head is usually pretty dumb. And often I'm really glad I don't share it, because it was probably kind of dumb, right? The more considered, reflective view is usually the better one. This is why I don't like a medium like Twitter. Twitter kind of encourages us just to say whatever pops into our head. Usually what's popping into our head, though, again, isn't the most careful, thoughtful, considered version of ourselves. So slow down, be careful. Maybe even, like, if you find yourself getting heated in the conversation, pause, stop the conversation, cool down a little bit, approach it again maybe in a better way. The last piece of advice that I'd give, and this is sort of a weird one, this is what's called the idea of falsifiability. If we're rational, our claim is that all of our beliefs are formed on the basis of evidence. Of course, we said this isn't true, but this is at least the goal that we're striving for, right? The things that we believe, we want to believe them because we have good reasons to believe them. So if that's true, it should actually be possible for you to figure out what could get you to change your mind on some topic. This doesn't mean you should change your mind necessarily, right? But this is just like, what evidence would change my mind on something? What could I discover that would get me to change my view? This is sort of the idea of falsifiability. My beliefs should be falsifiable. There should be some evidence that sort of overturns the reasons why I believe what I believe, get me to believe something new. I've often thought this was true in contexts where people sort of were denying that man-made global warming or climate change was taking place. I've often sort of wanted to just ask people almost like, well, okay, you say you don't buy it yet. Fine, right? I mean, that's fine. What evidence could get you to change your mind? And people frequently don't actually have answers to that question. Their sort of commitment to something like human-caused climate change not occurring, it doesn't seem to actually be evidence-based or reason-based. Because if it was, they could say, well, I need to see a study that showed X, Y, and Z, and if I saw a study that proved those things, then I change my view. That actually is indeed what happened in the sort of climate science community. Why so many people the climate scientists were indeed able to say, I don't believe this is happening now, but if you should show me X, Y, and Z, I'll change my mind. And then people showed X, Y, and Z. And that's why there's such universal agreement on that topic or near universal agreement on that topic within climate scientists. They sort of presented what could get them to change their views, got that evidence, and then changed their views. We can do the same thing in our own lives. We can sort of ask ourselves, what evidence would change my view? Then that can sort of help us in the inquiry. It can cause us to sort of almost just know what it is we need to be looking for and sort of be seriously investigating that matter with the possibility that maybe indeed we will discover evidence that causes us to change our minds, but also the possibility that we won't discover that evidence and therefore maintain our current view. And then the last thing I wanted us to talk about, let's go into a little bit how can we respond to fallacies in a more productive sense. So when we were talking about them, in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, we were talking about these in purely logical terms, right? We were just sort of wanted to diagnose what was wrong in the fallacy, what mistake was being made sort of on logical grounds, right? So that we can know to avoid arguments of that form and not accept them. And, just the fact that an argument commits a fallacy, that doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. It just means that that argument doesn't give us any reason to believe that it's true. But in real-world practical examples, it's usually not that helpful to just stop someone and be like, hey, guess what? That was a logical fallacy. That's usually not, people usually aren't going to react necessarily wonderfully to that. Maybe sometimes they do, but oftentimes they don't. And I think part of the reason for that is because usually these fallacies aren't just occurring in isolation. I mean, they are bad forms of argumentation, and we saw in a lot of cases the mistake is kind of obvious. The mistake is kind of pretty apparent, actually, if you stop to reflect on it. Usually these logical fallacies go hand in hand with at least one and maybe even more of the sort of psychological, social, and cognitive biases that we've been discussing throughout these videos. And so actually responding productively in a real conversation to a fallacy frequently involves more than just pointing out the fallacy. In some sense, you also need to address or respond to, in some sense, the bias that's leading to the fallacy. That's sort of causing the person to go wrong. So let's look at an example. So here's an example of an argument that commits the straw person fallacy. So there are no good arguments in defense of abortion. All people in favor of abortion are in favor of it because they're cruel and heartless and hate babies. Right? So why is this straw person fallacy? Well, it's simply misrepresenting the view of people who are in favor of the legalization of abortion. Right? Their view is being distorted. Those are indeed not the reasons why those people would present in defense of that view. Okay, but why is the person making this mistake? Well, we see that sort of that first sentence or whatever, right? There are no good arguments in defense of abortion. That kind of sounds like a my side bias, right? Someone who actually just genuinely is not aware of the reason why people who believe something differently than they do hold the beliefs that they do. So it's not going to be enough just to point out, hey, that's straw person, right? You're also going to need to say, hey, yeah, so I'm not sure. My guess is people who support abortion probably have better arguments than that. They probably have better reasons for the things that they believe. Maybe let's actually look and see why they do believe that abortion is allowable, and then we can sort of evaluate and see if what they're doing is right. So it's not just noting the logical mistake, it's also sort of pointing toward the underlying bias that led to the mistake and then trying to correct that in some way. And what we're going to do in the class session, in addition to sort of working on recognizing examples of these biases in various cases, we're also going to work on sort of formulating responses to specific fallacies that also try to address some of these sort of biases that are underlying them. Alright, so this is our last video of the semester, or at least our last of these pre-class videos. I'll make probably a couple more videos here or there just to go over some exams maybe, talk about some end of the semester stuff. But at least this is the last sort of material content video. Thank you all very much for, sitting through these this semester. I know I'm probably not the best videographer in the world. I hope I've at least improved a little bit, gotten a little bit better at it as the semester has gone along. Hope you're all doing really well. We finish up strong with the end of the semester. Talk to you later. Bye.